This is a $150 V-cut cigar cutter, and this is a $3 cutter. We're gonna put them head to head and see who comes out on top. Let's go.
First, we're going to be putting some wear on these blades by cutting into these cigars 20 times each to test ergonomics and feel. Each of these cigars is a 50 ring gauge hand rolled, which shouldn't be a problem for any of these cutters as they're all rated for 60 ring gauge and above. Then we'll drop each cutter 5 times each from 5 feet up to test its durability. After that, we'll take each cutter apart and assess the build quality. Finally, we test each blade sharpness twice to see which cutter has the sharpest blade using the best professional edge tester. You can find all of these cutters on Amazon.com, but we found most for a lower price on FamousSmoke.com. We are in no way affiliated with this company, but we like to give credit where credit is due. Famous, if you're watching and you would like to sponsor our bullet cutter video, please feel free to reach out at any time. These videos are expensive. What we are looking for with the V-cuts is a nice clean cut, not too shallow, which will expose enough surface area so that we can get a smooth pull and proper enjoyment from our cigar. Starting with the cheapest cutter is the Vertigo VC100 Vicotry V-cutter at just $2.99 or $6 on Amazon. It has a plastic body with stainless steel blade and is incredibly light to hold, cutting up to a 60 ring gauge. The initial cut was clean, slightly crooked, which may have been due to user error. This cutter was very easy to use, had fantastic ergonomics, and it sliced through the cigar like butter. It had a great cut, very clean, but not too deep. Next up is the Firebird Viper V-cutter with keyring by Colibri at $9.99. It is the lightest weight of all the cutters, has a rubber body with stainless steel blade, and can cut up to a 60 ring gauge. First impression was the ergonomics. I did not like holding this cutter at all. I had trouble keeping hold of it while performing the cuts. It had a great cut that was very clean. However, the cut was very shallow and couldn't grab on to much of the cigar. Being that these cigars are only 50 ring gauge, that kinda worries me when you get to the larger sizes, like a maxed out 60. Moving on to my favorite cutter from the Guillotine Showdown, the Cigarloong V-cutter for $20. It has a stainless steel and alloy combo with a gorgeous engraved design, very classy looking, and can cut up to a 60 ring gauge. This cutter had the best cut of them all. Very clean, very deep, no fraying whatsoever. The weight gave the cut a solid delivery and the ergonomics were very comfortable to hold. The result was a satisfying experience with incredibly deep and clean cuts. At $30 is the Lotus Jaws serrated V-cutter. We went with the gold and carbon fiber cutter, which is lightweight and stunning to look at. The body is made of carbon fiber and zinc with blades made of stainless steel that have a serrated edge as indicated by the name. It has the largest ring gauge so far at 64. The initial cut was pretty rough with uneven lines on one side and some loose tobacco. The ergonomics were very comfortable and easy to use. The blade action had a very nice feel to it with a very satisfying crunch, probably due to that serrated edge. The final result was decent with a nice deep cut. Next, at $41 is a Xikar VX2 V-cutter. This was the only cutter on the test that can be found cheaper on Amazon than Famous's website. This cutter can reach up to 70 ring gauge, but it's mostly suited for up to 64 from the shape of the bowl. It has stainless steel blades, but I couldn't find any information on the body. I believe it's aluminum. This is the first cutter on this test that has a locking mechanism as well as spring-loaded action. The initial cut was nice and clean with a deeper, wider cut than most, which is best for more volume. The blade springs up pretty far, which is a little difficult to get a grip on. I typically wear large gloves, so this would be suited better for someone with XL hands and above. The actuation has some nice weight to it, and the cuts were very clean with very little tobacco residue left behind. Jumping all the way up to the Colibri Quasar 2-in-1 desk cutter for a wallet-busting $150. But at the time of this recording is 20% off at FamousSmoke.com. This cutter is very hefty and has both V and guillotine cut. Upon pressing it, releasing the locking mechanism, it pops up using 4 oiled pistons. The V-cutter goes up to a 60 ring gauge. On the bottom is a rubber gasket making sure this cutter doesn't move when using it, and it has a reservoir for your trimmings to keep your desk very clean. The cut was very deep and clean, but not as clean as some of the others. Obviously, this isn't meant to be handheld, but it did well enough ergonomics-wise. The cut was the deepest by far. And very impressively, not a single flake of tobacco fell onto the floor during all 20 cuts. The drop test. We used a light stand with a rod to ensure each of our drops were from the same exact spot. Starting with the Vertigo Victory, the first 2 drops went as expected, but the blade did expose itself, which can be dangerous. However, that was the least of the Victory's problems as it completely exploded on the 3rd drop, as you can see here. I figured this cutter would do well because it was so lightweight, but I was completely wrong. Next is the Firebird. This cutter had no issues at all. With its lightweight combined with rubber outer shell, it didn't even have a scratch on it. This is no doubt a great cutter for those that are prone to dropping things. Moving on to the Cigarloong. I didn't have the highest hopes for this one because it is just so heavy and had some gnarly bounces. The blade exposed itself slightly on a couple of the bounces, but barely noticeable. In the end, it came out with the most minor of cosmetic damage. This is a very well built cutter. The Lotus Jaws. This cutter had some pretty crazy bounces, like it's full of energy. The force exposed the blade almost entirely on some of the drops and a little bit on the rest. And again, we have a cutter that has very minor cosmetic damage. Next up is the Xikar VX2. The dual locking mechanism just wasn't up to the challenge of our 5-foot drop test. On multiple occasions, this cutter popped open, exposing the blade. It might have something to do with how strong the springs are. When you release the locking mechanism, they explode upwards. This was yet another cutter that walked away with minor cosmetic damage, operating perfectly after the drop test. And the test that I was most worried about, the Colibri Quasar desktop cutter. This thing is heavy, very heavy, as witnessed by the paint marks it left behind. This cutter is not meant to be portable, so it's unlikely that you would drop it from this height, but it is the 21st century and many of us have standing desks. On 4 of the 5 drops, it popped open, exposing the blades. It also took quite a bit of cosmetic damage, but the functionality is still perfect and ready to go. I was pretty impressed. Although it is the most expensive cutter by far, it has the worst form factor for a test like this one. Let's check under the hood and see how these cutters are built. With the Vertigo, it wasn't a problem as gravity took it apart for us. It's a very basic, plastic mold tongue and groove type build. The Firebird Viper came apart very easily, revealing a slightly more complex plastic build and a couple of steel guide rods. The Cigarloong has a similar build to the Firebird with the exception of its metal body and these two odd-looking guide rods. The Lotus Jaws had almost the same exact build as the Cigarloong, but had an additional 2 guide rods in its metal mold. The Xikar VX2 stepped up the complexity with its spring-encased and metal sleeve design. These springs had a lot of punch to them as one came out so fast that it was barely captured within 1 frame of this video, even though we were shooting in 60 frames per second slow motion. The Colibri Quasar desktop cutter was much more complicated to open up. It houses 2 blades and a center shaft and 4 spring-loaded tubes. Although Colibri's website claims this cutter has quad-oiled pistons, we did not see or experience any oil, but the actuation is nevertheless butter smooth. Now that we have massacred these beautiful cutters, we are left with a graveyard of pieces and just the blades so we can test their individual edges for our final test, the Sharpness Test. Sharper is always better, right? Well, we were surprised to learn that sharpness isn't the end-all be-all of this type of cutter, but it does help to have a sharp blade for clean cuts so you don't end up with a lot of tobacco residue in your mouth. Some of the blade tongs were a little too long for the sharpness tester, so we had to cut the tips off. The Colibri Quasar. It's difficult to see the results from this angle, but this cutter did a 570 followed exactly by another 570 on the second test. The Quasar is nothing if not consistent. After that, we tested the sharpness of the Vertigo Victory, which had a much better score of 245 on the first test and an even more improved 196 on the second cut. Following after that impressive performance is the Firebird Viper, which took the lead with a 190 but followed with a not so impressive 330, which may be due to some wear we put on the blade earlier, so not all spots of this V-blade are very sharp. The Cigarloong did okay with a 365 and a 540, putting it just under the Colibri Quasar. The Lotus Jaws brought the numbers back down to something a little more manageable with a 325 and a 310. The serrated edge may not be doing it any favors. The Xikar VX2 told the Cigarloong to hold my beer and went for the all-time high with a 650 and a 1095. Yikes. Here you can see the sharpness scores laid out. The Vertigo Victory, our cheapest cutter, won this test with the second most affordable cutter not far behind. I find it interesting that the cheapest cutters outperform the rest of the field, but from the cigar cut test, I have to say that this isn't the whole story. Although the Vertigo Victory had the sharpest blade, it didn't have the cleanest cut. That honor goes to the Cigarloong. Each of these cutters have their pros and cons, but 3 stood out for different reasons. The best budget cutter is the $3 Vertigo Victory. It has a very sharp blade that cuts really well and it's super lightweight. You won't even notice it in your pocket. Just don't drop it or you'll find yourself shopping for a new cutter. The Cigarloong, yet again, wins best value in my opinion. It looks amazing, has the cleanest cut, and is very durable for $20. You will get your money's worth and then some. The Colibri Quasar. This cutter has one very cool feature for the neat freaks. It has that reservoir to catch all the clippings, which makes it very worthwhile. This cutter gives you multiple options for cuts and is incredibly durable. This is probably a one-and-done purchase, if you only smoke in one location, since it's not very portable. Now that you've seen these results, go check out our $70 versus $3 guillotine cutter showdown. It also has some surprising results.